world. Thank you so much. So, the topic for this evening's talk is, what is it again? It is focus on the essence rather than the armor, basically. It's really asking you to not feed the armor, but feed the essence. And I'm sure that most of you will be aware of what that means. It means not to feed the weaknesses, not to feed the weaknesses, not to feed the behavior traits, but really to focus very much on soul awareness, which are the main qualities of the soul. So I'm going to actually introduce it by saying that we build armor, which are like shields based on outer awareness, out of perfectionism, out of pleasing and control to protect our vulnerabilities, which are our weaknesses. But over time, the weight of the armor that we wear actually, what does it do? It suffocates the soul. So when we stop protecting our perceived weaknesses that we ourselves qualify and accumulate without understanding that we're doing that, when we stop doing that, qualify and accumulate weaknesses, we finally free up the energy to live from our truth, our unshakable essence. So, what is feeding the armor instead of the essence? What is it that's feeding the armor instead of the essence? So until we begin to actually listen to our spiritual alarm clock, and all of us have a spiritual alarm clock that goes off at different times. So when we start to listen, we are focused more on feeding. If we don't listen to the spiritual alarm clock, actually, we are focused more on feeding the body and the personality traits instead of feeding the soul. We'll prioritize status, wealth, and possessions and how we look. And in doing so, we are also feeding the ego. We're feeding fear of rejection or we're feeding feeling inadequate. And we build coping mechanisms, which are really behavior traits, those outer consciousness awareness. We build those behavior traits around it like armor. And what we do is we pour 100% of our daily energy into maintaining that perfect shield that we've created around ourselves. And this means that we are not being soul conscious. We are not being aware of our non-physical eternal self. We are self-conscious, which means that we are posing to look good.
Okay, thank you. Have a good day.
So please can you put your mute your Zoom, please, because I can hear speaking in the background. So the context for this talk is that we live in a world of polar opposites that constantly asks us to feed the armor. Yet the truest path to embracing our essence actually lies in our awareness of the non-physical self. So I've just mentioned awareness. So let me say a couple of things about awareness. Concerning awareness, whatever it is that is happening, When we focus on essence, good or bad, when we focus on essence, we are shifting our percep per perspective from just being a survivor to one of self-empowerment. And in this way, what we're doing is we are progressing through different levels of awareness, from victimhood, which is at the lowest level possible, to being a survivor, which is the next level up, to being self-empowered, which is the third level up. So at one level, we are victims to whatever it is that we experience in the world. At the next level, because we've done some work, we are surviving. But what we want to aim for is that place where we feel totally self-empowered. And at that level, where I'm operating from spiritual strength, not just physical or intellectual strength, um, but I'm actually really mainly focusing on spiritual strength. And in relation to these three different levels of awareness, what's important is knowing and understanding knowledge of the self. But knowing and understanding knowledge of the self is one thing, whereas putting it into practice is another thing. For example, we understand that anger is a weakness, don't we? That causes dis-ease of the mind and disease of the body, but we have difficulty being peaceful when anger is triggered. It's because we've developed a pattern that we are addicted to. So when we take ownership of spiritual knowledge and we understand it, we can navigate the different levels of awareness from victimhood to survivor to being spiritually empowered. And we can easily put into practice at that level, focusing on essence, which is our inner strengths, whilst transforming the weaknesses that we accumulate, the patterns that we've accumulated, the attachments that we've accumulated. Okay, so the sign of taking ownership is putting what we understand about spiritual knowledge into practice. As I said, knowing it is one thing, but putting it into practice is another thing. For example, we cannot become the change we wish to see in the world without practice, without the practice. So, at the Brahma Kumaris, we have a saying, when I change, the world changes. When I change, you change. So it's always me first. I have got to change before anyone outside myself or within my orbit changes. So our weaknesses, which are actually born out of feeding the armor, for example, anger, our weaknesses carry with them important messages for us to help us go. That's very interesting to actually note because later on, when there is time, it would be good to have a conversation, some interaction with you around this whole notion that our weaknesses carry with them important messages for us. So in our spiritual knowledge, we have a very useful saying that really helps us to accept the very difficult things that often happen in everyday life. And the saying is, the drama is always accurate, which actually means that when we take ownership, become self-empowered, we become self-empowered and wiser. We understand that there's always something beneficial occurring in what is happening to help us grow in understanding life at a much deeper level. Yes, there are some really shocking, tragic things when they happen, um, immediately you cannot imagine that there's anything beneficial that comes out of that experience. But later on reflection, through your growth, you'll see where you will have grown from that situation. So, what I'm aiming to talk about is to help us to see how by feeding the armor, by feeding the shield, we use coping mechanisms, which are in a sense behavior traits to manage our weaknesses. And in doing so, hopefully, you will go away this evening with at least one thing that you will be practicing in order to feed the essence, um, rather than the armor. So, what is the sign of inner strength? What's the sign of inner strength? The inner strength we get from feeding the essence. You might want to make a note of that for yourself, but I'll just talk about that. And again, if you have any questions that you want to ask at the end of the talk, then please feel free to ask those questions or make any comments. So what's the sign of the inner strength we get from feeding the essence? So it's not what we are necessarily good at. The sign is not what we're necessarily good at, but what energizes us in a lasting, not short-term way. It really makes us feel whole within ourselves because we are addressing our unmet needs from within rather than taking benefit, relying on the external, such as the coping mechanisms, such as dependency on people, situations and things, overthinking, shutting down, avoiding, or even numbing the self through whatever source I am linked to in actually numbing the self. And these behaviors, they amplify our weaknesses and compete with our focus, keeping our essence from taking center stage, keeping the soul from taking center stage. Now, that is serious, isn't it? For those of you who takes the time to come to these sessions, I'm sure you know that. So, what is it that amplifies or diminishes the essence? My response to that is awareness is what amplifies or diminishes inner strengths, which means that we are focusing on, building the essence rather than the armor. Um, we are so influenced by our physical world of opposites. We relate only to what we can see. And out of attachment to only what we can see, there's a saying, seeing is believing. So that's where we are when we're feeding the armor. If we don't see it, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't make any sense. So we relate only to what we can see, and out of attachment to only what we can see, what we do is that we take on the identity of whatever we are triggered by. If we are insulted, for example, we're sad. If we are praised, we're happy. I'm sure that makes a lot of sense to all of us. So we know that identity and self-image work, in that it could be either opposites of the spectrum, but works. Whatever it is that I think I am, good, bad, or indifferent, that's what I'm going to be in terms of my actions, my thoughts. So the basis of our true inner strength is actually understanding the impact of identity and self-image on our levels of awareness. For example, whatever I say and think, say, and do is based on how I see myself, and how I see myself determines how I relate to myself, and how I relate to myself will determine how I relate to others and the world around me. And an example to kind of just break this down, if I'm feeding the armor through a pattern of being easily upset, when my expectations are not met, it means that I need to feed the essence by being more accepting and loving to myself, especially when I don't meet my own expectations. For example, I may fail an exam. I may fail my driving test, but the most important thing for me to think under those circumstances is that I am perfect as I need to be right here and now, and I am willing to try again. So it's looking at the perceived failure in a positive way, and really aligning with soul awareness, as opposed to allowing your awareness to be dragged down into negativity. So weaknesses are a natural part of our reality in a world of opposites. For example, a coin cannot exist without both sides. And the soul, which is the essence, cannot exist without the armor, the body. Soul and body have got to work together within this dimension. But if I focus on feeding the armor, my weaknesses, the coping mechanisms, I will spiral into an abyss of flaws and be unable to align with my soul and see my inner strength. I hope that makes sense. And don't forget, please make a note of your questions so that we can have a conversation later. So how do coping mechanisms, how do they stop us from focusing on strengths? So what happens is that we amplify our weaknesses because we use coping mechanisms to hide from our discomfort rather than face them. So, for example, I use anger um, uh, to actually mask the feelings that I'm having rather than face them. We don't have the practice of sitting with self, going inside and having that gentle conversation with self to stop us from using coping mechanisms, using weaknesses. So, for example, I'm talking about the armor, which is actually referring to somewhat of a shield that we use to protect ourselves. So when a coping mechanism becomes an automatic shield, being the armor, it really is like a personality trait which starves our inner strength. It starves our inner strength. So if your natural strength is deep empathy, for example, or should I say clear communication, but you cope with conflict by shutting down, what happens is that you actively deny yourself the chance to use those gifts, and your strengths begin to weaken from disuse, which explains why we must practice feeding the essence. It's like having an arm that has been broken and it has to be put in a sling for a period of time. What normally happens is that the arm, although it's actually healing, the use of it, it's become weakened. So it's lost the ability to move as dexterously as it would normally. So you have to put that practice in to get it back into full use. The other thing to say is that coping mechanisms, like overthinking, avoiding, or numbing, basically what they do is they function as a temporary relief from a perceived weakness or fear, meaning we are using what is referred to as old patterns to cater for our unmet needs. In other words, coping mechanisms that we are hiding behind to cater for our unmet needs. However, because these behaviors feed the physical identity, they never fix the root cause of the addiction that feeds the armor. So we're steeped in taking on the identity of our weaknesses. That's interesting, isn't it? We're steeped in taking on the identity of our weaknesses. And why is that the case? Because the um, underlining weakness, or should I say vulnerability, um, actually grows in the dark, gathering momentum and influencing our choices. And it's like, I would say, an underground stream that we are unconscious of, that is there trickling away and causing havoc to our lives, and we are not really aware of what is going on. Um, and the interesting thing is that the coping mechanism takes over the identity, and we may not necessarily be consciously engaged with these inner thought processes, but they are there anyway. And it could, the identity that I take over could be, I'm afraid, I can't cope, I need to move away from this situation in order to protect myself. All of all are identities that I've taken on. And eventually, what will happen is that the coping mechanism actually takes over, and one begins to believe that the limitation is who they are, and they'll fall into a deep sleep, which is, in other words, the comfort zone of weaknesses, feeding the armor. Okay, so I find as a result of that, I find myself in a situation where I've created a protective shield called the armor that becomes an important part of my identity. And basically, what's happening is that I find myself deferring to the shield. And when we constantly defer to the shield, we are handing over our power, allowing our weaknesses to loom much larger than our inner strength. And so just looking at the time, I'm just going to briefly talk about the interplay between thoughts, feelings, and emotions, and what we can do to focus more on inner strength, focus more on the essence, feeding the essence. So negative and waste thoughts feed feelings of fear, which makes me feel insecure and unsafe. They create the conditions for negative emotions, which are in themselves coping mechanisms. Negative emotions are in themselves coping mechanisms that reinforce weaknesses. So, how can I change this pattern of behavior? First, soul, the essence, doesn't actually need to learn anything. It already knows everything. And so repetitive experience in life, like weaknesses showing up, they're basically showing us the cycle we keep repeating over and over and over again until we learn the lesson. And it's all about understanding knowledge, spiritual knowledge, and taking ownership through practice. Okay? It's important to understand that you're not your weaknesses. You need to let go of the identity of any like coping mechanism that you find that you practice. So let go of the identity, the feeling and belief that you're not good enough. Whatever it is you're that's taking energy from you, you simply have a strong tendency to feel and act in a particular way. The other thing to say is that if you hate something, you're attracting and you're magnetizing it to you, not because you want to, but because you have a strong reaction to it, which means that whatever it is I resist persists. Anything that you have a strong reaction against, you are creating and attracting into your experience. The other thing to say is that if you are defined by situations that you believe um, in, um, there's a lack of self-awareness. So if you're defined by situations that I believe in, that the situation dictates, there's a lack of self-awareness, and this creates victim consciousness. So for example, if someone says something to you and and it's not a nice thing to say and you become angry because of that, what you're doing is you're taking on the identity of what that person has uh, said about you, by becoming angry. So it means that you've taken on the identity of being weak, and whatever is in the way is stronger than yourself. So we don't have to buy into what people say or what the world tells us that we are. We have to have that strong belief and faith in ourselves that we are enough without anything external um, telling us that we are enough. So, how do we shift the lens from feeding the armor to feeding the essence? Um, so coping mechanisms, or should we say weaknesses, make they look bigger simply because they demand so much attention. They look bigger than your strength. They look bigger than the energy because we've made them so. Remember, we have this belief in only what we can see, not what we can feel or experience as the non-physical self. So the attention, so the moment we pause and step into a space of self-compassion, and we realize that the coping mechanism is just an old script that we no longer need. It's an illusion that will fade when we begin to believe that it's an old script. We can stop managing the weaknesses and start living from our inner strength. And an affirmation that would be really good under those circumstances would be, I choose to be happy despite my flaws. Everyone has flaws. Every single person on this planet has flaws. And these flaws are there to help to make us grow by actually seeing them as an illusion and actually changing our mindset to a more powerful identity. So I'm going to ask you a question. So when you look at your own daily life, your daily routines, do you actually notice a specific habit based on a weakness that feels like it's taking up a bit too much space for you right now? So just think about it, make a note and make a note of it. And if you want to discuss it later on, that would be fine. So just moving on from there. So in our spiritual teachings, we learn about the importance of becoming the detached observer. In other words, what I would say that means is having an objective relationship with your weaknesses. Okay, so I failed in doing something, a weakness came up, or I may have got angry with someone or shouted at somebody. Do I go away and beat myself up? No, that's the idea. So becoming a detached, having an objective relationship with your weaknesses is actually viewing your weaknesses without judgment, without emotional attachment, without judgment or shame. Basically, as I said before, they are flaws um, to work with and for us to change. They are not there to define us. That's the worst thing that we can do. Allow them to define us. It's really very much about changing the self instead of using the brain, which is um, analyzing and making matters worse as we spiral out of control into this abyss of weaknesses that I mentioned earlier on. So, it's a question of detachment versus attachment. So, attachment is dependency, detachment is very much about being whole and supportive of yourself. So it's a question of detachment versus attachment. If I get angry because someone says something to me, then there is attachment there of some sort, right? If I don't, then I'm detached. I'm not affected, okay? And I can love that person anyway. I'm not angry towards them. I don't wish them any ill. I'm really quite neutral. And that's a lovely place to be. So, for example, when I am attached, when I'm detached, for example, no, I need to go back a bit. Oh yeah, so when I'm detached, I'm objective. So when I'm detached, I am objective. And in under those circumstances, what happens is that I view a weakness as a temporary behavior pattern. I view the weakness as a temporary behavior pattern. Because in the background of my mind, there's this mindset I'm perfect as I am right here and now, and I'm willing to change. Um, and this means that we're feeding the essence because we have um, an objective relationship with our weaknesses. We are not allowing our weaknesses to define us. So it's attachment, de detachment versus attachment. Both, each are at totally different ends of the spectrum. So I'm going to talk about attachment now. So when I'm attached, it means that I'm having a subjective relationship with my weaknesses. It's like an emotional relationship with my weaknesses or the situation that I'm faced with. That so I'm viewing a weakness as a personal failure, and the sorts of thought patterns that would be appropriate to this is that I'm bad at this, so I'll never succeed. I'm bad at this, so I'll never succeed. So basically, I'm not giving myself an opportunity to grow here. And this means that we are feeding the armor actually instead of the essence. And what is the result? We spend all our time thinking about the weakness we're trying to hide. So for example, that my self-esteem is low. We end up defining ourselves by what we are defending against rather than leaning into our natural strength. Yeah. So um, I'm gonna stop here, but I'd like to do a guided meditation. Um, but I think possibly the best thing to do is not to do the guided meditation now, but to um, wait until after the question and answers, and then we can uh, do the guided meditation. So the floor is open. Do you have any questions, any comments that you want to make or ask? It's quite a deep subject, and I hope that at least some of it made sense to you. Okay, okay, all right. So there are no questions here, no questions. Um, the question is, I'm going to give you an opportunity. So do you find that there's a behavior pattern or something about weaknesses that's taking up a bit much of your time at the moment? And is there anything that you feel that you can do about it? that will enable you to move forward on this. I'm going to stop recording now so that you can share.